the secret history of Russia's bloodiest war, and the rise of Vladimir Putin. What if I told you that a forgotten war in a tiny corner of Russia gave birth to one of the most powerful and controversial leaders of the 21st century? That a series of mysterious explosions, rogue warlords, and a city bombed into oblivion set the stage for the rise of Vladimir Putin? What really happened in the basements of Ryazan, and could the Russian government have bombed its own people? This is not just a war story, it's a political thriller, a spy drama, a tale of tanks, traps, and total mayhem. From the empire striking out in 1994 to Putin's power play in 2009, we'll unravel the twisted saga that turned Grozny into a graveyard and Putin into a president. So buckle up, history buffs and truth seekers, because once you enter the wild, wild east, there's no turning back. You'll laugh, you'll gasp, and you'll question everything you thought you knew about modern Russia. Once upon a time, in the crumbling ruins of the Soviet Union, a tiny republic called Chechnya decided it had had enough of Moscow's micromanagement. In 1994, Russia, still nursing its post-Soviet hangover, launched a military operation to squash Chechnya's independence dreams. But instead of a swift victory, the Russian army got a masterclass in guerrilla warfare from Chechen fighters who knew every mountain pass and alleyway like their own backyard. The war ended in 1996 with the Kosovo Accords, a ceasefire that was less peace treaty and more, we'll pretend this never happened. Russia withdrew, Chechnya declared de facto independence, and Moscow licked its wounds while Chechnya descended into chaos. Chechnya, now free but battered, resembled a post-apocalyptic oil-rich Mad Max zone. Infrastructure? Gone. Economy? What economy? The male population was armed to the teeth, and warlords like Salman Raduyev, Arbi Barayev, and Shamil Basayev ran their own fiefdoms. Kidnappings, extortion, and oil smuggling became national pastimes. President Aslan Maskhadov, elected in 1997, tried to impose order, but his secular policies clashed with rising Islamist sentiment. Field commanders wanted a Sharia state, not a democracy. Maskhadov banned militias, adopted Sharia law, and still couldn't stop the spiral. Then came the ultimate uh-oh moment, the kidnapping of Russian envoy Gennady Shpygun at Grozny airport. Russia responded with an economic blockade and troop buildup. In August 1999, Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab led 2,000 fighters into Dagestan, trying to create an Islamic state. Maskhadov condemned it, but the damage was done. Russia, already on edge, saw this as an invasion. Locals and Russian forces pushed the militants back into Chechnya's mountains. Then came the apartment bombings. In just 16 days, 5 explosions, including 3 in Moscow, killed over 300 people. Russians were terrified, furious, and desperate for answers. Enter Vladimir Putin, the freshly minted prime minister and former head of the FSB. He blamed Chechen terrorists. The timing was suspicious. He was appointed just 4 days after the Dagestan incursion. Whoa. If you're still watching, you clearly love a good dose of history, mystery, and political intrigue. And trust me, we're just getting warmed up. If you want more jaw-dropping stories like how a war turned a spy into a president, or how a market bombing changed the fate of a nation, then hit that subscribe button right now. The Ryazan incident was the plot twist. Locals spotted shady men hauling sacks into a basement. Police found explosives. The car registered to the FSB. Putin praised the vigilance, but then FSB chief Nikolai Patrushev claimed it was a training exercise and the sacks contained sugar. Sweet, right? Not everyone bought it. Historian Yuri Felshtinsky and ex-FSB agent Alexander Litvinenko wrote Blowing Up Russia, accusing the FSB of staging the bombings to justify war. Litvinenko was later poisoned with polonium in London, a signature move, some say, of the very agency he exposed. Even General Alexander Lebed, former Security Council secretary, told Le Figaro, "I am almost certain of it," when asked if the government could bomb its own citizens. With the public in panic and Chechnya in disarray, Putin seized the moment. He launched the Second Chechen War, promising to restore order and crush terrorism. It was his political baptism by fire, and it worked. Russians saw him as a strongman who could protect them. By 2000, he was president. But this wasn't just about Putin. Russia feared a domino effect. If Chechnya could break away, why not Tatarstan or Siberia? The war was brutal, long, and costly. Cities like Grozny were flattened. Thousands died. But by 2009, Russia had reasserted control and Chechnya was reincorporated into the Federation. It was early September 1999 and Russia had had enough. After the chaos of the First Chechen War and the humiliating retreat that followed, the Kremlin was itching for a rematch. And this time, they weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to obliterate. On September 6th, Russian jets roared into Chechen skies like angry hornets, dropping bombs on what they claimed were military targets. Translation: anything with a roof and a shadow was fair game. Power stations? Boom. Oil infrastructure? Kaboom. Communication towers? Zap. Chechnya's landscape lit up like a Christmas tree. If Christmas involved high explosives and screaming civilians, by September 18th, Russian troops had blockaded the border like bouncers at a nightclub, except instead of checking IDs, they were checking for insurgents and occasionally shelling the bushes. Then came September 23rd, the day Russia said, "Let's make it official." President Yeltsin signed off on a counter-terrorism operation, which was Kremlin speak for "let's flatten Grozny again." The Russian Air Force went full throttle, turning Chechnya's infrastructure into rubble faster than you could say strategic ambiguity. Meanwhile in Chechnya, President Aslan Maskhadov, a secular man in a very unsecular situation, realized he needed a miracle. So he did what any desperate leader would do. He called for a Gazavat, a holy war. That's right. The man who once tried to keep religion out of politics now begged religious leaders to rally the faithful against the Russian juggernaut. But Chechnya wasn't exactly a picture of unity. Maskhadov's political scene was more fractured than a dropped iPhone screen. Warlords like Shamil Basayev and Ruslan Galayev had been beefing with Maskhadov before the war. But now he appointed them commanders of the eastern and western sectors. It was like hiring your ex to plan your wedding. Risky, but desperate times call for desperate warlords. Chechnya had around 10,000 fighters, half of whom were holed up in Grozny, ready to turn the capital into a fortress of fury. They were outnumbered nearly 10-1 by the Russian army, which had 80,000 to 100,000 troops massed at the border like a tsunami of tanks and testosterone. This wasn't the ragtag Russian army of 1994. Oh no! This time they came dressed to kill, literally. They had mountain warfare units, better air-ground coordination, and generals with names that sounded like Bond villains. Colonel General Kazantsev led the whole operation. Lieutenant General Troshev commanded the eastern grouping. Major General Shamanov, yes, Shamanov, led the western grouping. General Tkachev took the north. Lieutenant General Bulgakov handled Grozny like a man with a vendetta. And the man selling this war to the public? Not Yeltsin, who was busy being old and tired. It was Vladimir Putin, the new prime minister and former FSB chief, who famously declared he'd wipe out terrorists in the shitter. Yes, you read that right. The man promised to chase terrorists into the toilet. Russia had found its action hero. On September 30th, the Russian army rolled into Chechnya like a steel avalanche. Their first goal? Secure the terrain north of the river Terek. The northern grouping advanced toward Kalinovskaya and Shelkovskaya, while the eastern grouping pushed in from Kizlyar. By October 16th, they had locked down the north like pros. The Chechens resisted fiercely, but their main plan was to make a stand in Grozny, just like they did in the First War. Maskhadov begged Russia to negotiate and even called on NATO to intervene. NATO responded with a resounding, "Who's Chechnya again?" By October 18th, the Russians crossed the Terek and began the second phase, encircle Grozny and cut it off from the rest of Chechnya. It was a siege in slow motion, with tanks, artillery, and airstrikes closing in like a python around its prey. It was October 21st, 1999, and Grozny's central market, normally a bustling hub of barter and borscht, was turned into a cratered graveyard. The Russian military claimed it was a den of illegal arms dealing. What followed was one of the deadliest civilian bombings of the war. Up to 140 people killed in a single strike. The message was clear. No place was safe, not even the cabbage stalls. And if you thought fleeing was an option, think again. The so-called humanitarian corridor for civilians to escape Grozny, targeted by Russian airstrikes. That's right, the exit door was booby-trapped. It was like offering someone a parachute and then setting it on fire mid-jump. In early November, Mufti Akhmat Kadyrov, once a fierce fighter against Russia, suddenly switched sides and surrendered Gudermus, one of Chechnya's biggest cities. It was a jaw-dropping betrayal that foreshadowed the rise of his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, Putin's future enforcer-in-chief. By mid-December, Russian forces had steamrolled through Oshkoy-Martan, Urus-Martan, Argun, Konkala, and Shali, effectively encircling Grozny like a boa constrictor with a vendetta. Chechen fighters launched ambushes, but the Russian war machine was too massive, too methodical, and too merciless. In the First Chechen War, Russia left the southern exit of Grozny open, hoping rebels would flee. Instead, Chechens used it to reinforce the city. This time, full blockade. Russian forces closed in from 5 directions, turning Grozny into a pressure cooker of death. On December 6th, Russia issued a chilling ultimatum: leave through the corridor or be considered a combatant. Translation: we're going to bomb everything, and if you're still here, you're fair game. On December 15th, Russia made its first big push. Tanks and APCs rolled in from Konkala, only to be annihilated in Minutka Square. 7 tanks and 8 APCs destroyed by Chechen fighters. It was a stunning defense, but short-lived. By January, Russia had captured Argun, defeated Ibn al-Khattab's group, and despite a brief Chechen counterattack on January 9th, the tide had turned. Russia recaptured Shali and Vedeno, and by February took Idym-Kal, severing key supply lines. On January 17th, Russia launched its final assault on Grozny. By the next day, they had seized the Sunja River Bridge, and the city became a full-blown combat zone. Chechen fighters tried to escape south, but were shredded by minefields and artillery. On February 6th, Putin declared Grozny captured. The war moved to the mountains, where Russia created the central grouping to hunt down the remaining rebels. Chechen fighters waged guerrilla warfare for years, but Russia had a new strategy: co-opt the elite. Leaders like Kadyrov, the Yamadayev brothers, and Kakiev switched sides. Rebels were picked off one by one. Al-Khattab killed in 2002, Jalayev in 2003, Maskadov in 2005, Basayev in 2006. Kadyrov was assassinated in 2004, replaced by his son Ramzan, who now rules Chechnya like a mini Putin with a beard. Chechnya receives 300 billion rubles annually, about $4.5 billion, and Ramzan's crew acts as Putin's shadow enforcers, allegedly involved in political assassinations. The war gave Putin massive popularity, helping him win the 2000 presidential election. He used this legitimacy to dismantle democracy, abolish governor elections in 2004, and centralize power like a true czar. The Chechen dream of independence was crushed by internal division, exhaustion, and lack of international support. Russia's military was better trained, better equipped, and politically ruthless. Casualties: 6,000 to 14,000 Russian soldiers killed, at least 3,000 Chechen fighters dead, 25,000 civilians killed by 2007, according to Amnesty International. The Second Chechen War wasn't just a conflict, it was a political crucible. It forged Putin's regime, crushed Chechen independence, and reshaped Russia's future. From the rubble of Grozny rose a leader who would dominate Russian politics for decades. And there you have it, the war that built an empire, the siege that shaped a strong man, and the story that rewrote Russia's future. If this deep dive into the Chechen wars and Putin's rise had you hooked, then trust me, there's so much more where that came from. Don't miss the next chapter in history's most dramatic saga. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join our growing army of truth seekers and history lovers.